Okay, great. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is our first scoop of the new year. A few more people coming in. And it's hosted by our Executive Director, Mark Pearson. And for those of you who don't know Mark, he's been associated with the Alliance for over 15 years, either as a member of the board or as our executive director. And tonight he's going to be giving us a quick recap of 2021 and forecasting 2022. So we're so happy you're here, and go ahead, Mark.
Well, welcome everybody, and glad to see you all here, and glad it's not a powder day that you're all out still trying to get home from the slopes. So great to see everybody. Appreciate you tuning in. You know, the Zoom thing has been both a blessing and a curse, but maybe more than a blessing than we might have realized when all of COVID started, because it's great to be able to have people from San Luis Valley attending, and from Farmington, and from all over our region. So it makes it a lot easier to, engage and connect with folks. So I'm really pleased to see y'all here, and thanks a bunch. So I thought I'd just kind of run through some of our highlights from last year, and many of those will carry forward this year in terms of unfinished business that we need to hopefully get over the finish line in 2022, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for some questions and discussion about any of the things that maybe I didn't touch on along the way here. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen here, and hopefully that'll work. And if folks can let me know, does this can you all see the opening slide? Good, great, thank you. Right, well, welcome. Like Rayna said, I've been involved with the Alliance for quite a long time, and for many of these issues take many years, so it's good to be able to see them through from start to finish. And with that, I think I'll just jump into the presentation here. So this is our mission statement of San Juan Citizens Alliance. San Juan Citizens Alliance advocates for clean air, pure water, and healthy lands, the foundations of resilient communities, ecosystems, and economies in the San Juan Basin. And, this is sort of a snapshot of the Alliance. We have about 1,100 dues-paying members at this point, mostly from here in the southwest part of Colorado and northwest New Mexico. About another 7,000 or so people that we have email addresses for, or other kind of contact information, although Rayna and Susan are working on fine-tuning that, so that number may change in the near future. And we're guided by a 9-member board of directors. So there's I think 6 or so from the Durango area, and a couple from Montezuma County, and 1 in Farmington at this point. And our staff is 8 at this point. We have an office in Farmington, Mike Eisenfeld down there, and then the other 7 of us are generally here in the Durango area. So that's the quick snapshot of the extent of San Juan Citizens Alliance. We've been in existence since 1986, and our program areas kind of fall into these 4 buckets at this point: an air or climate and energy category. Water, we're the Animas River Keeper, so that's kind of a focus of our water work. A land component, and then most recently in the last couple of years, we started tackling wildlife with a dedicated staffer. So I'm going to go through each of these 4 areas and kind of highlight some of the things that we have been working on and that we will be working on going forward. So first, I'll jump into the lands protection category. There's sort of 3 big efforts underway that would significantly change and protect the designation and management of hundreds of thousands of acres of our public landscapes here in the San Juan Basin in both Colorado and New Mexico. And the 3 things I really wanted to highlight here immediately are the CORE Act, which is the acronym for the Colorado Outdoor Recreation and Economy Act, a statewide Colorado Wilderness Act that affects about 120,000 acres here in Southwest Colorado, and then the pending withdrawal from oil and gas development for lands surrounding Chaco Canyon. So the CORE Act is the statewide compilation of what were previously 4 separate efforts. And ours was called the San Juan Mountains Wilderness Act to begin with. We started working on this back in 2009. And here it is 12, 13 years later, and not quite over the finish line yet. But this is the gist of what's in the CORE Act for our part of the world here in Southwest Colorado. It's about 60,000 acres. About half of that is new wilderness designations, the biggest piece being doubling the size of the Mount Sneffels Wilderness to include the rest of the Sneffels Range. The Mount Sneffels Wilderness only barely includes Mount Sneffels itself. The summit of Mount Sneffels and the southwest flank is in the wilderness, but the face of Mount Sneffels, that's the big dramatic view everybody sees from Dallas Divide, is not actually in the wilderness area, or the range to the east of Mount Sneffels, all the big peaks like White House and Potosi and so forth. And then there's some smaller additions to the Lizard Head Wilderness, and the first BLM wilderness that would be designated in Southwest Colorado, McKenna Peak, which is out in Disappointment Valley. And then particularly of interest here maybe is the area around Ice Lake Basin up at the headwaters of South Mineral Creek and the headwaters of the Animas. And so the area around Ice Lake and Hope Lake over on the other side of the range would all be part of what's called the Sheep Mountain Special Management Area, which it couldn't get designated as wilderness because there were some conflicting uses there that don't comply with the Wilderness Act. So it had this other categorization of a special management area. So that's what's in the CORE Act, or the San Juan Mountains piece of the CORE Act. The Colorado Wilderness Act then is a different piece of legislation. It's been pending for 20 years now, and its primary sponsor is Representative Diana DeGette, who's in the Denver area. And it deals with primarily lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management across Colorado. These are mostly the wilderness study areas that were first designated way back in 1980. Down here in our part of the world, there's probably about 120,000 acres that are included. So, the BLM in Colorado does actually manage 3 of our 14,000 foot peaks up in Red Cloud and Sunshine and Handy's peaks near Lake City. But mostly it's the desert landscape. So places like canyons along the Dolores River corridor, Weber and Menifee Mountain down outside of Mancos, Cross Canyon and Cajon Canyon in Canyons of the Ancients National Monument. Those are all areas that are in this pending Colorado Wilderness Act, and that hopefully we'll see some progress in 2022. So both the Colorado Wilderness Act and the CORE Act have passed the House of Representatives, and for a bill to become a law, both the Senate and the House have to pass the same bill. So the House has passed both of these bills in the past year, but we're hopeful then that the Senate will finally get around to being able to take them up and pass them before the end of 2022. On the left here, you can see this is Congresswoman DeGette and her staff. They were out on a horseback tour of Cross Canyon Wilderness Study Area a couple of years ago in the summer of 2019. And on the right is Blaine Basin, which is on the right below the north face of Mount Sneffels. So that's part of the addition to the Mount Sneffels Wilderness. And that was a tour we did with some local business supporters and staff members of the congressional offices here in Colorado a couple of years ago. So hopefully 2022 will be the final ring the final bell on that. And then around Chaco, earlier this year, or last fall, the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, announced a temporary moratorium for 2 years on any new oil and gas leasing within a 10-mile buffer around the Chaco park units. And there's currently, so the 2-year moratorium is in preparation for potentially a 20-year administrative withdrawal. You can only withdraw lands from oil and gas development for up to 20 years through an executive action by the presidential administration. If you want it to be done permanently, you need a law passed by Congress. But for the time being, we've got this public comment period to comment on whether folks think this 20-year withdrawal to prevent new development around Chaco, new leasing around Chaco is worthwhile or not. And if you look at the map, you can see it's a pretty complicated management jurisdiction. The National Park Service manages Chaco, the purple area in the middle, but the dark orange colors are all administered by Navajo Nation, and the lighter sort of yellowish, orangish lands are the BLM lands that are the subject of this mineral withdrawal. The mineral withdrawal wouldn't apply to Navajo lands or to the white sections, which are private, or the blue sections, which are state of New Mexico lands. So that's pending throughout this year. There'll probably be an environmental analysis of it, an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment, and a decision may be made later this year on whether or not to proceed with that 20-year withdrawal. It does not affect the impacts. There's a lot of Navajo communities like in Liebrook and Counselor that are impacted by oil and gas development. And so this doesn't address a lot of those impacts that they're already dealing with, but it would limit sort of future new leasing, at least as one step towards helping to kind of safeguard the area around Chaco. So those are the three big ticket items on the lands program. Our climate and energy program, we've been working for many years on transition as San Juan Generating Station closes. And this is a picture of the San Juan mine and the San Juan Generating Station, which are just outside of Farmington, northwest of Farmington. We've worked a lot on trying to clean up and get a different electricity supply for our local electric association co-op here in La Plata County and Archuleta County, which is the La Plata Electric Association. We've dealt a lot with methane emissions, which is a big contributor to greenhouse gases. And then an up and coming project we're going to be focused on is the interest in hydrogen development. So a San Juan Generating Station, there's 847 megawatts that are still in operation. 2 out of the 4 units there closed a few years ago. So there's 2 left. It's supposed to retire and shut down on June 30th of this year, which will be a landmark event. Public Service Company of New Mexico, which is the main operator of the plant, they're on tap to fund $20 million in community transition economic assistance. And in the works are several large-scale photovoltaic solar plants. The BLM last week actually just issued a decision on the first of those, which would be 600 megawatts immediately adjacent to the San Juan Generating Station on the east side of the power plant. There's another, that one's called the San Juan Solar Plant. There's another one called the Shiprock Solar Plant, which would be immediately on the west side of San Juan Generating Station. And to us, that's a pretty ideal circumstance where you put the new renewable energy development smack dab on top of or next to the existing disturbed lands. So it's taking advantage of the power, the substations and the transmission lines, and it's already disturbed habitat. And so it's kind of an exciting transition there for sure. So we've been trying to nudge the BLM along there to issue the permits that they need to. There's some requirements for rights of ways for transmission connections and that kind of thing, and some road access permits. So hopefully that we'll see that happen pretty quickly. And there's several other solar projects around northwest New Mexico. So those those will be pretty exciting to see happen in the coming years. Yeah. And then in terms of our local energy supply, so LPA, we are under contract. We have to buy 95% of our electricity from Tri-State, which is a big multi-state transmission and generation company. And most of their electricity currently comes from burning coal, a lot of it from Craig, Colorado, but also there's a power plant in Arizona in Springerville, and one in Wyoming in Wheatland, where Tri-State gets a lot of its coal-fired electricity. So Tri-State's in the process of trying to transition out of burning so much coal. It's slow, and they have literally $3 billion in debt from those power plants. So it's a complicated transition. LPA would like to get out of that faster if possible. And so in this coming year, I think LPA will be looking at a minimum, potentially negotiating a deal to get out of basically half of their contract with Tri-State and be able to move to local electricity supplies, which might be renewable, solar or other renewable sources. And it will save LPA customers at least $7 million a year to start with. And then once we totally get out of the contract, it'll be a much greater savings in the future. So that's well underway, and it's a testament to the forward-thinking folks on the LPA board of directors these days who are looking at ways to save money and to clean up our environment and reduce our climate emissions from our electricity supply. Methane, well, this is a map of all the oil and gas wells in the San Juan Basin, centered around Farmington and Aztec and up to the area south of Durango. Over 30,000 wells here. You don't have to add them all up yourself. I'll just tell you there's over 30,000 at least, and they leak a lot of methane. Methane's a very potent greenhouse gas. It's probably about 80 times the impact of carbon dioxide in terms of its heat trapping capacity. So it's a really important thing to focus on in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions coming out of the Four Corners region here. And there's a whole bunch of successful activity that's happened about in adopting rules to reduce methane pollution from the oil and gas industry. In the last year, Colorado, the Air Quality Control Commission here adopted rules that will require much more frequent inspections. It used to be you only had to inspect many of the wells one time in their lifetime when they were built, and that was it. Nobody ever went back and looked at them ever again for methane pollution. So these new rules should help meet some pretty ambitious methane reduction goals of 60% by 10 years from now. New Mexico has similarly adopted some strong new methane rules, and their objective is to capture 98% of the methane from natural gas operations that's being emitted now by 5 years from now, and they'll prohibit just venting of methane or natural gas out of the wells as part of that. So that's a big improvement. And in the coming year, New Mexico has another rulemaking that the Environment Department in New Mexico will be undertaking that will further improve methane pollution coming from well sites. And nationwide, the Environmental Protection Agency is also in the middle of a methane rulemaking. So that'll help improve rules across the country, even in states that haven't been as aggressive as New Mexico and Colorado in addressing that. So hydrogen, what is hydrogen? So it's you've probably heard about hydrogen fuel cells for a long time, and hydrogen is potentially a very clean burning fuel once you have the hydrogen, and it can be used to reduce emissions from really high energy intensity needs, industrial needs like steel making and cement manufacturing. And it could also be used for things like replacing diesel in shipping and railroads and things like that. But it's very hard to create in an efficient, economically efficient way. And we're concerned because in New Mexico, there's a big push to use natural gas as the source for creating hydrogen, which would further perpetuate natural gas extraction across the San Juan Basin. And as we've seen, there's a lot of methane that gets leaked out of the natural gas industry, and it would probably set back a lot of our climate goals if we try to fully embrace a big natural gas-based hydrogen industry here in Northwest New Mexico and Southwest Colorado. So this will be a big focus of legislation in the New Mexico State Legislature over the next month. And we'll be tracking that to see what transpires. Yeah, so that's a quick whirlwind view of what's happening in our energy and climate program. Our new wildlife program I started a couple of years ago. The things we're focused on primarily are wolves and bighorn sheep and lynx. In terms of wolves, Colorado voters in 2020 adopted a new policy in Colorado to direct Colorado Parks and Wildlife to do planning to reintroduce wolves in Colorado, which were exterminated about 70 years ago. So by the end of 2023, wolves should be reintroduced to somewhere in Colorado west of the Continental Divide. One of the requirements is that there be a compensation program created for impacts to ranchers that may lose livestock to wolf depredation. Our staff program manager, Gary Skiba, he's on the Colorado Parks and Wildlife statewide stakeholder advisory group that's helping to work through some of these questions. And already they, in the last few weeks, they adopted a new rule in Colorado that allows for livestock operators to haze or harass wolves to try to keep them away from bothering their livestock. So that's one immediate step. But I think by the end of 2022, we'll see the plans really be fleshed out on how the wolf reintroduction effort will happen and where it will happen, and all the parameters of managing wolves once they're more widespreadly on the ground here. So that's happening this year. Bighorn sheep has been another priority for us in the last year. It's kind of surprising, I think, to most folks to hear that we don't have any more bighorn sheep today than we did 100 years ago. That's certainly much different than with our other big game animals like deer and elk, which have been, are many times more plentiful than they were 100 years ago. The San Juans probably have some of the best interconnected habitat and herds that are original native herds that haven't been supplemented with transplants from other places. And the big threat to bighorns is diseases that are transmitted from domestic sheep, a respiratory disease in particular. And that has really constrained bighorns to a pretty confined territory and prevents them from expanding and occupying all of the habitat that's probably available in the San Juans. So the big need here is to retire and close domestic sheep allotments that are in bighorn habitat up in the high country in the San Juans. And if you look at a map here, you can kind of see this is a map of part of the Weminuche Wilderness north of Durango and north of Vallecito Reservoir. You can see Vallecito here kind of in the bottom center of the picture. And so the colored sections here, like that, this one that's yellow with S28, that's the big critical tier 1 bighorn sheep native herd in the middle of the Weminuche along the Pine River up there. And then you can see another one to the west, in the West Needle, it's called S71. That's another herd. And in between those two, these sort of bluish green horizontal slashes, these are all domestic sheep grazing allotments. So they're kind of right smack dab between these two native bighorn herds. And that's the kind of thing that really breaks up the San Juans in terms of the ability for bighorns to be able to spread across the intervening habitat. Because once bighorns come in contact with domestics, they're presumed to be carrying, have been infected with this respiratory disease, and CPW will remove and euthanize any bighorns they see that intermingle with domestic sheep. So one of the things that happened a couple of years ago, this Endlick Mesa allotment was purchased by National Wildlife Federation. They made a payment to the sheep grazing permittee who agreed to relinquish the grazing allotment in exchange for a cash buyout. And so that Endlick Mesa allotment is now no longer being grazed by domestic sheep. So that's a way to kind of help create more of a buffer around the existing bighorn herds, but that'll be one of our focuses in the coming year, is to get the Forest Service to finalize the grazing management plans for the Wemnich Wilderness and permanently close some of the remnant domestic sheep grazing allotments up there. Then our rivers program, as I mentioned, we're the Animas River Keeper, so a lot of our focus is on the Animas. We've been working much over the last couple of years on getting a bunch of the tributary streams in the Animas watershed designated as an outstanding waters designation under Colorado's water quality rules. And then we're very much engaged in keeping track of what's happening with the Bonita Peak Mining District Superfund site cleanup, which is up at the headwaters of the Animas River where the Gold King mine spill happened. So outstanding waters, it's the highest level of protection that you can grant a stream in Colorado. It typically is applied to streams in our wilderness areas and national parks, but we were interested to try to expand that to some of the other pristine headwaters tributaries of the Animas River. And after a couple of years of work, this spring, the Colorado Water Quality Control Commission will be looking at our proposal. We've worked with Trout Unlimited and Mountain Studies Institute and a number of other entities to put together a really strong package. Have a bunch of water quality data that we've collected over the last couple of years to justify the designation as outstanding waters. And the streams that are include the upper parts of Cascade Creek and Lime Creek, up past Purgatory, up on the way, between Mullis and Coalbank passes, Grasshopper Creek, which is a tributary that comes down into the Animas, kind of east of Electro Lake on the other side of the Animas Valley. And then a couple of creeks that are part of the town of Silverton's domestic water supply, Boulder Creek and Bear Creek, which are a couple of great pristine streams up high. And there's a whole bunch of others that are proposed by particularly Trout Unlimited over in the Dolores River headwaters, as well as a couple of others like Quartz Creek over on the east end of the San Juan National Forest. And then the Bonita Peak Superfund site, so it was designated, I guess, in 2017, a couple of years after the Gold King mine spill. And so the EPA has been very slowly moving along at trying to do site characterization and understand what's happening with hydrology, and wanting to figure out ahead of time if they plug some of the leaking mines, what will happen to that water? Will it just back up and stay underground forever, or do we need to worry about it popping out somewhere else, for example? So that's the kind of thing that there's been a lot of scientific hydrogeological work to try to understand. And it's consumed about $75 to $100 million already in terms of that sort of research and some of the immediate short-term actions to try to deal with an interim water treatment plant to clean up some of the water that's coming out of some of the mines. And that's what's here at Gladstone in the picture. And one of the things that will happen this year is that the EPA and the company that still owns the Sunnyside mine up there, Kinross, there'll be some kind of an agreement reached between the EPA and Sunnyside and Kinross about financial damages from some of the pollution that's been caused up there by the interconnected mine workings of the mines in the upper Gladstone area, the Red and Bonita and Gold King and Sunnyside and all that complex. So we'll be participating in reviewing and making comments on that settlement agreement to see if it's appropriate or not. And then there's just a whole bunch of things we kind of we do in terms of watchdogging. We're sort of like the neighborhood watch group, I guess you'd say. So there's always all sorts of things happening. There's the village of Wolf Creek that is still staggering along. We have a pending lawsuit on the village at Wolf Creek challenging the Forest Service's approval of a road right of way that would make possible the development. This is an artist's rendition that was put together by the developer of what it would look like up there on top of Wolf Creek Pass. So stay on top of that. There's some big, there's a bigger and bigger emphasis on timber management and logging these days. So we're engaged with that. This administration has a big focus on orphaned oil and gas wells. And so we've been digging into the circumstances around Farmington in particular about the many hundreds or thousands of wells that are inactive or shut in or could be orphaned. There's a scheme to try to keep Farmington's power plant, the San Juan Generating Station, operating for another 10 years as an experimental carbon capture plant that would still spew 500,000 or 1 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, even if it worked precisely as it was designed. But it seems to be mostly an effort to capitalize on some very generous federal tax credits and subsidies that a few folks have figured out a way to kind of get rich quick, unfortunately. And then there's always new gas wells proposed, like around the HD Mountains. There's land exchanges we're tracking. There's one called the SJCA exchange over in the Pagosa area. There's travel management plans. That's where the BLM or the Forest Service makes decisions on which trails are going to be open to motorized or non-motorized use. And we've in particular been trying to get the Forest Service to tackle over snow travel management. So in the wintertime, what places are open to snowmobiling and motorized use and which ones are for quiet recreation in the backcountry. And then we track a lot of what's happening both in Colorado and New Mexico at the state legislatures on legislation that might be of concern to us or interest, and at the federal level as well too. So there's kind of always an endless number of things and many things that we don't yet know are going to happen yet this year that we'll have to be prepared to respond to. And that's kind of this, keeping track of what's happening in the hood, so to speak. So that's a big part of what we focus on as well. So with that, I just want to express our thanks to you all, because without all of you who both contribute financially to keep us going, but also respond to our calls for action and write letters and call your elected officials and show up at meetings and, send letters to the Forest Service and the BLM or county commissioners. That's all what we need in order to, collectively do the work we all want to do to make sure our home turf here stays in good shape. So with that, I'll maybe open it up to questions, and glad to respond to whatever folks want to ask about or talk about.
Norman Norville had a question mark in the chat. He had asked who will designate the animus as an outstanding water. Will it be the feds or the state, or who would that be?
That's the state. So it's the State Water Quality Control Commission in Colorado that does that.
Mark, this is Seth Fertney. I'm curious whether you are at all involved in Lake Night horse management whatsoever, or if that is completely outside of your watch.
Yeah, we haven't been engaged in that at all. And I presume you mean things like the non-motorized versus motorized days and that kind of a thing. But yeah, we have not been engaged in that at all over the years. All right, so I see a few questions here, so I'll try to answer some of those. So there's a question from Catherine Holt on how do we decide what's inside or outside of our watch. It's a good question. So we have kind of a geographic turf, which is basically the San Juan Basin. So that's sort of our side of the Continental Divide, you might say, the San Juan National Forest in Colorado, the BLM field office in the Tres Rios field office managed out of Dolores, and then the BLM lands up around Silverton. And then in Farmington, the Farmington field office of the BLM. So Northwest New Mexico, San Juan County, basically, by and large in New Mexico. So that's our geographic area of interest. And then, we've traditionally for a long time been engaged in oil and gas and energy stuff, probably longer than anything else, and also the public lands management. So those have been two of our primary focuses for many, many years. And then wildlife we got more engaged in recently because partly because of the wolf referendum, knowing that the San Juans probably had the best and much of the best habitat probably for wolves. And so if they were coming here, we figured it'd be good for us to be engaged in that, as well as lynx having been, reintroduced into San Juans, and this is sort of the heartland of their habitat as well. So it made sense for us to be tackling wildlife, but and then it's basically capacity limited too. So we want to do a decent job of the things we tackle. So we try to prevent ourselves from too much mission creep and taking on things that we can't handle. So if you have any particular questions of why we don't do something on any specific issue, I'd be glad to chat with you about that. So the status of Wolf Creek. So there were two lawsuits on the village at Wolf Creek. First in, I guess it was 2017, the Forest Service initially approved a land exchange. So the issue with Wolf Creek has always been there's this 300 acre or so private land inholding up there near the ski area that's not owned by the ski area, it's owned by somebody else, Rayna Dickerson in Texas, who was wanted to turn it into a big residential development of, variously a couple thousand housing units of various kinds that could hold 8,000 or 10,000 people at one time up there. So a big deal. But the issue is that they don't have access to Highway 160. So they need to get access to the highway to build the development. And one way they have proposed to do that is to do a land exchange to reconfigure their land ownership. So they'd give some land to the Forest Service and in exchange get some land that would make them abut the highway. So then they'd be right on the highway and they could build their development out. Well, we challenged that decision, that land exchange decision. And in 2018, a federal court threw it out and said the Forest Service's environmental analysis was inadequate. And so that land exchange was overturned. But the Forest Service had already executed the exchange. So they'd already given a deed to the National Forest land to the private landowner, and the private landowner had given a deed back to the Forest Service for the other parts. And then there were a whole bunch of interconnected easements and things, like some of Wolf Creek ski area's ski lifts cross both the forest and into the private property. And there's a bunch of complicated easement agreements there. So all those, they executed the land exchange and exchanged all these legal documents, and then the land exchange was thrown out later. So then they had to undo all that stuff and execute deeds back and forth to each other and to nullify things and put stuff back the way it was to begin with. And so at the end of December, that's the decision you saw that the court said, okay, 3 years after we ruled the land exchange was invalid, they finally got everything put back the way it was before they started. So that's what that decision was. So the other decision, once the land exchange was thrown out in 2018, the Forest Service issued a different decision and said, well, we'll just give you a road across the national forest to get to the property, and you can, use that to develop it. But that was based on the same environmental study that the court already threw out for the land exchange. And so we filed a lawsuit on that one. And so that lawsuit is still pending over that different way of granting access to the development there. And who knows when that decision will be reached. We're just everything's briefed and been argued in front of the court. And so whenever the judge issues a ruling, they'll issue it. And we really don't have any idea of when that could happen. It could happen next week, or maybe it won't happen this year at all. So that's the gist of what's happening with Wolf Creek, I think, at this point. Let's see. Oh, the landscape behind me. Of course, that's BLM land. That's what, wouldn't you know? So that's up outside of Silverton. So it's under land administered by the Bureau of Land Management. So it's at the top of Boulder Gulch and the South Fork of the Animas River. So up in it's called the, I guess the Storm Peak roadless area that the Bureau of Land Management manages. So nice turf. Nobody really goes there. I shouldn't have told you, and I'll probably regret that. But yeah, so we have some new staff that came on board this year, and one of them is Rayna Dickerson, who introduced the discussion today. Rayna came to us in June, I think she started, and she's our communications manager, and at some point we'll have her talk about some stuff too. Grew up in Ridgeway, so we're happy to have her come on board. And then we have another new energy and climate program associate, Emily Frogen, who works on a lot of things with Mike Eisenfeld related to Farmington and LPA things here and methane and so forth. So so that's new. And then also we have one of our newest board member, Michael Rendon, who's on today. Michael, as you might know, has been around Durango for a long time. He's now a big shot professor up at the college, but once was the mayor of Durango and was on the LPA board and worked with a lot of nonprofits around here. So we're really psyched to have him. And then Steve Ellison, one of our other board members, is on the Zoom here today too. Steve's in Farmington, and he's our financial whiz or advisor. So we really appreciate Steve being our board treasurer. Links, update on links. Well, we probably have somebody much better qualified to talk about links on the call today, and that'd be Randy Gormley, who was the biologist for the Rio Grande Forest for many years and was, deeply engaged on link stuff. So Randy, I don't know if you want to pipe in here and kind of give a lay of the land on what's happening with links these days.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I've been retired for 3.5 years now. I was the wildlife program lead on the Rio Grande National Forest here for the best of 17 years. I also worked with the San Juan staff, of course, quite a bit over there. About 3 of those years, I was like an enterprise biologist, so I was like an internal contractor. I worked a lot on the San Juan over there in those days. Of course, the lynx reintroduction that occurred, 218 lynx from 1999 to, 2007 or 8. That reintroduction over those years, not all at once, but over those years by primarily Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but a lot of citizens and agency folks were involved in that as well. The state has gone through a couple processes to monitor the status of the lynx since that reintroduction, and they still are. There is a monitoring program that involves remote camera sets, snow tracking, and let me see, those are the primary ones. And, it really is a program to determine occupancy and look at occupancy over time. And that is ongoing. If folks really want to know more about that, I encourage you to look at the Colorado Parks and Wildlife website. And I'm sure you can find updates on that probably I haven't seen for a couple of years. But I will just mention also on this side, because we had a massive forest structure change in the Spruce Beetle that started around 2002, 2003. And we've shared the love with you guys over on that side too. So your forest, you've seen rapid change in some of your spruce system, which is where the lynx primarily occur. So there was a lot of concern about that and some other things. And I brought on the Forest Service, probably one of the best lynx gurus in the nation, and John Squires out of the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And we collared and then sampled habitat for 4 or 5 years here on this forest, and then also a little bit on the G-Mug over there by Lake Fork. And there's a study, that study was published in, let me see, I guess 2018, it's Forest Ecology and Management. And if you look that up in Google for, links, you'll probably find that paper, or I could share it with Mark or whomever. But in a nutshell, we found that the lynx, there's not many breeding lynx down here, even though the core area is really the Rio Grande, the San Juan, a little bit of the G-Mug. We don't have a whole lot of breeding females that we know of. Probably a half a dozen is all breeding females on the Rio Grande. I don't know about the San Juan side, but they seem to be stable. They seem to be occupying the places that they were. We found also with sampling, Jake, Ivan with Parks and Wildlife, some of the sampling on the hares is that the hares are really doing well. They're responding really well to, as you'd expect, the reduction in canopy layers in the spruce zone. They're an understory species, primary prey for the lynx. They're doing very well and responding very well. Food sources are there. The red squirrels have disappeared in many places. So we don't know about that. That's a secondary prey when the lynx, or excuse me, when the hares do dip, which they do in Colorado, not as deep as they do up north, but there is a dip. And remember those 2 years of reproduction, early reproduction, there were no kittens, probably had a low hair. So in a nutshell, it looks like the lynx are, you'll see the Parks and Wildlife call them stable. They're occupying the places as far as we know that they were. And that's pretty much what we know. It's ongoing monitoring with Parks and Wildlife primarily. So that's my story. But look up our great publication in Forest Ecology and Management. It really has some good stuff in there with John Squires, myself, and other authors.
Thanks, Randy. That's great. Appreciate the update.
Yeah.
So there's a question about what's the probability of the CORE Act and the Colorado Wilderness Act passing this year? Well, we have fingers crossed that there'll be some way to either pass it, by themselves, or they'll be attached into some big giant omnibus package that everything, gets combined onto a so-called must-pass piece of legislation. But sort of given the dysfunction in the United States Senate these days, it's it's probably a long shot, but we're keeping our fingers crossed and hoping that there'll be some sort of mechanism that will finally be able to get those across the line, because they've been vetted for decades now, and there's really no reason that to have them continue to be held up. Another question here from Seth about our relationship with other related organizations in the area and governing agencies. So we work really close with Mountain Studies Institute on a lot of these things, where Mountain Studies does the science, and then we can use that information to advocate. So with the Outstanding Waters designation, that's probably the best example where Mountain Studies sort of designed the water quality sampling in data collection, and then we were able to help massage that and turn it into the proposal that the Water Quality Control Commission needs in order to make the designations. San Juan Mountains Association, we haven't worked with as much recently. They do the really tremendous visitor contact work, for like staffing visitor contact stations at Ice Lake and up at Highland Mary Lakes Trailhead and on Molos Pass. So they do really terrific work in terms of visitor education. And so we stay in touch, but we probably don't work real closely with them. We do have a pretty good cordial relationship with our federal agency managers here. And, San Juan National Forest, we can certainly talk with the forest supervisor and the staff here on the one hand, but on the other hand, we can also file objections and lawsuits when they need to as well. And I think we kind of all realize that's sort of the way it works. But I think we have a pretty good relationship, and we've been working a lot more with the city now, and the city's sustainability efforts. And we're hoping that with Marty Pools being hired over there to be the city sustainability coordinator, that will blossom and be even more productive going forward. So we're pretty interested in seeing how that evolves. Yeah, and then there's a question in terms of like, what's the, what's our best hopes for San Juan Citizens Alliance? And I would love to finally see our wilderness bills pass. That would be one of my biggest hopes, since we've been working on that for so long. But some things happen so much faster than we could ever have imagined. So when we first started having staff in Farmington about 15 years ago, it was to mobilize opposition to what would be the third big coal-fired power plant down there. It was called Desert Rock. It would have been 1,600 megawatts adjacent to Four Corners power plant, using the same mine basically. And so when we started tackling that, we were thinking, oh my God, boy, this could be a big effort to just try to stop this new one from being built. And in little over a decade, not only did that one never get off the ground, but the two others that are there are on their way out the door. I mean, San Juan Generating Station will close this year. I mean, who could have imagined, 10 years ago that the big coal-fired power plants that sort of defined our region would be gone, and they would be replaced by, renewable energy, photovoltaic plants and battery storage. And so we probably should be more ambitious than we are, but ideal, I guess the couple of big ticket items in addition to that, the power plant conversions basically from coal to solar, you might say, will be, the demise of the village at Wolf Creek finally and forever, and some sort of permanent resolution to that awful proposal, and and the enactment of our permanent wilderness designations here to kind of finish up the protecting the high country up in the San Juans. So and emerging issues that kind of just we just kind of deal with them as they come up. Hydrogen is probably the best example. Like a year ago, we would never have imagined that there'd be this big push to turn our natural gas fields into the source fuel for a big hydrogen economy. So that's things kind of come out of the blue at us, and we probably don't have to spend a lot of research trying to identify them. They kind of smack us in the face. So I think that's how we end up dealing with it. And then a question about MSI in the Bighorn monitoring stuff. So one of the reasons we got engaged in Bighorns is that there's a decent amount of science. Mountain Studies has this great citizen science program around Bighorns now, where you should, if you're in the high country and you see Bighorns, to report the location and kind of help build out that database. And so we're finding that Bighorns are certainly much more prevalent than just those colored blobs on the map. They are much more widespread. But while there was a lot of interest in collecting the data, there other organizations, because of their missions, they were not really able to take that and be the advocates that we can be. So Gary Skiba, just our wildlife guy, presented at the Colorado Wildlife Commission meeting last week to be basically advocating that Colorado Parks and Wildlife biologists be kind of unleashed to be really more outspoken advocates for the biology of bighorns, and be able to just say, here's what bighorns need. They need to be kept away from those domestic sheep, and be able to advocate to the Forest Service or the BLM on changes to sheep, domestic sheep allotments. And so that's the sort of thing where we can take the information that's been collected by somebody like Mountain Studies and then translate it more into being an advocate to encourage mostly the federal agencies, the BLM and the Forest Service, to make changes to how they manage domestic sheep. And we also were really fortunate to be able to partner pretty closely with National Wildlife Federation. Those guys are the ones who are able to go in and try to negotiate with permittees and offer them cash buyouts to relinquish their allotments. And that's really kind of the solution to making them financially whole, getting those sheep out of the landscape, and kind of widening the terrain that's available for native bighorns. Yeah, so any other questions? I guess we're close to our presentation, but I really appreciate everybody's attention and great questions, and look forward to working with you guys all in the future. If you have any questions, there's a lot of tremendous expertise on this Zoom video screen, so we really appreciate whether you have agency expertise or landowners, like I see Kathleen from Delzell here, owns beautiful place out in the HD Mountains, and others who are really deeply invested in this place and have a shared commitment to wanting to make sure we keep it the way it is and improve it where we can. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Cool. Sorry we couldn't do it in person.